Thank you, President Schefter. Good evening, everyone. As you know, the board asked us to conduct a study to allow time for thoughtful discussion, research, analysis with stakeholder input on our current Native American logo. This evening's meeting and presentation was scheduled as a part of this study and to gain cultural awareness and perspectives from Native American individuals on behalf of the National Congress of American Indians. In regard to the format this evening, at the conclusion of the presentation, the board will have the opportunity to ask our guest presenters questions, and following the presentation, there will be a time for public comment from any community members who wish to do so. At this time, I turn it over to Dr. Mary Dankosky, who will introduce and welcome our speakers for the evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Lamont. First, on behalf of Dr. Hollinger and our Perspective Subcommittee, we truly just want to send a heartfelt thanks to the board for allowing tonight's special meeting to be possible. I'm honored tonight to introduce our special guest to you. Janna Allen is a citizen of the Quapaw Nation of Oklahoma and is a descendant of the Cherokee Nation and Yuchi peoples. She's the Director of Civic Engagement and Special Projects at the National Congress of American Indians, where she oversees the Indian Country Counts, as well as works on strategic communications and outreach efforts, civic engagement activities, and educating the public on the harm caused by Native American themed mascots and imagery. In addition, Dr. Ian Record is the Vice President of Tribal Governance and Special Projects at the National Congress of American Indians. He leads NCAI's efforts to create, coordinate, and share knowledge, tools, and resources that tribal nations and leaders need to strengthen their governance systems and more effectively exercise their sovereignty. He also oversees several NCAI projects like Ending Indian Mascots Initiative, the Tribal Climate Action Initiative, the Tribal Food Sovereignty Advancement Initiative, and the Building Tribal Economies Initiative. Prior to this, he was the manager of educational resources for the Native Nations Institute for Leadership. And in addition to all of that, he has earned his PhD in American Indian Studies from the University of Arizona. So I welcome Ms. Allen and Dr. Record to Southern York County, and I'm excited to see their presentation.
Thank you so much. I'm going to turn the floor over to my colleague Janna to kick us off, and then we're going to, following her remarks, we're going to share about an 8-minute long video clip from our NCAI First Vice President, Dr. Aaron Payman, who also serves as chairman of his tribe, the Sault Ste. Marie tribe of Chippewa Indians in Michigan. We had hoped he was going to be able to join us tonight, but he had a scheduled conflict. But luckily, he speaks a lot about this issue. We had the opportunity to record him in the past, and his remarks will be directly on point to the conversation this evening. And then I'll follow up to talk a bit about the movement nationally and what it looks like today and how we are working to educate and inform schools in this area. So with that, I'll turn it over to my colleague, Janna Allen.
Thank you, Ian. I appreciate that. Hello, everyone. My name is Janna Allen, and like was mentioned, I'm a citizen of the Quapaw Nation of Oklahoma, as well as a descendant of the Cherokee Nation and the Yuchi peoples, who are also based in Oklahoma today. I'm pleased to be with you this evening, and I really thank you for the opportunity to be here and to share a little bit of my own experience in this area, and provide some factual information alongside the rest of the presentation this evening that I hope will convey a comprehensive view on Native-themed mascots and imagery. So as you know, I'm here representing the National Congress of American Indians, where I serve as the Director of Civic Engagement and Special Projects. And in addition to overseeing NCAI's, civic engagement initiatives, one of the special projects in my portfolio includes NCAI's work to help educate the public on the harm caused by Native-themed mascots and imagery. And while my current profession lends itself to this important public education work on this particular subject, I also bring with me a unique background, not just as a tribal citizen, but also as a former professional athlete, and more importantly, as a former student. So while I personally was not faced with Native American themed mascots as a tennis player specifically, my scholarship as a student athlete at a Division I university had a great impact on my life and actually affected my decision to come to NCAI and work further on this issue. So at the time, several years ago, when I was a sophomore in college, Native themed images, logos, and names were still being used fairly widely at all levels of educational institutions and in professional sports. Indulge me for a moment, if you will, and imagine for a moment. It's football season, and everyone is feeling the excitement of an upcoming game against a visiting school with a Native themed mascot. Team posters and signs and sidewalk chalk are everywhere, feeding the football frenzy that's taken over the school and the community. Sidewalks have the home team's campus read, "Scalp the Indians," and posters declare, "Hey, Indians, get ready for the Trail of Tears Part 2. Or perhaps everywhere you look, there are images of the head of a Native man, and that head is often painted red. While this seems like a generic scenario, this was my experience and the experience of many other Native Americans across the country who are confronted with these very situations. The actual slogans that I mentioned were very real posters and things that have been seen on school campuses with schools who had either Native logos, mascots, or team names. For me, as a direct descendant of survivors of the forced genocidal removals from traditional homelands, the Trail of Tears comment immediately strikes home and induces a heightened concern for safety in that particular environment. And the red-faced logo, that evokes the painful history of the government bounty announcements calling for the bloody scalps of Native American peoples. And I ask you to consider, in a family-friendly educational environment, such as school athletics or just day-to-day activities on a school campus, should children be confronted with ridicule, perhaps, or imagery that symbolizes the deep and painful chapters of Native American history? Should Native American children who are a part of a community be made to feel as if somehow they are an enemy or savage, or perhaps something less than, when all they wanted to do was root for their home team? Should they be met with caricatures who don't reflect who they are, their culture, their families, or just Native Americans as living, breathing, diverse, and contemporary peoples? These are some examples of enduring racism, mistreatment, and harm embedded within dominant societal beliefs, yet they evoke visceral and negative emotions for many Native people. These same feelings of shame and disrespect are often met with derision and aggression by their defenders, who have never perhaps experienced the emotional, psychological, or cultural harms these images and stereotypes themselves. And that's why we're here with you today. We believe that people are reasonable and that when given the opportunity to view things from different perspectives, supported by facts, they'll do the right thing. And so in 1968, a little bit about NCAI, we launched a campaign to address such stereotypes and of Native people in popular culture, media, schools, and sports. Over the last 50 years and more, a groundswell of support has mounted to bring an end to the era of racist or harmful Indian mascots in sports and popular culture. Today, that support is stronger than ever, and NCAI's position is clear and deeply rooted in our 77 years as a leading voice for Indian country, which, by the way, consists of 574 distinct federally recognized tribal nations across the country and dozens more of state recognized tribes as well. NCAI has passed many resolutions since 1968 promoting the removal of Native images and mascots. But since 2012, NCAI has unanimously passed 6 resolutions dealing with Native or Indian-themed mascots, including resolution to support the NCAA ban on Indian mascots, commending efforts to eliminate racist stereotypes in sports and calling on the U.S. President and Congress to combat these continuing efforts to harm Native peoples in this way. Supporting the elimination of race-based Native logos, mascots, and names by state athletic associations receiving federal funds. Urging the U.S. Secretary of Education to take substantive action regarding schools with Native sports stereotypes. A resolution in support of efforts to exert economic pressures against the then Washington, D.C. National Football League team. And most recently, a resolution opposing the Washington NFL team's return to the District of Columbia until the franchise changed its offensive name. Each of these resources and resolutions are available on NCAI's website, which is www.ncai.org/proud-to-be. And if you would like to read the resolutions in full or to view some of our other resources or materials that we're mentioning here, I would please encourage you to visit that website. I would also encourage you to think about the progress made in each of these areas just from these 6 resolutions in the past several years. Hundreds of tribal nations, national and regional tribal organizations, civil rights organizations, school boards, sports teams, sports and media personalities, and individuals and allies have called for the end to harmful Indian mascots, and for good reason. One of the most well-known that you all may be familiar with was the retirement of the Washington, D.C. football team name and mascot last year in 2020. So there has been movement on this front. Native peoples remain more likely than any other race to experience crimes at the hands of a person from another race. Native youth experience the highest rates of suicide among young people, with studies showing that negative stereotypes and harmful Indian sports mascots are known to play a role in exacerbating racial inequity and perpetuating feelings of inadequacy among Native youth. It's vital that all institutions, especially school systems, reevaluate their role in capitalizing on these stereotypes. For reference, just to make that point a little bit more clear, of today's American Indian and Alaska Native population, those under the age of 18 make up 32%, and Native youth under the age of 24 represent nearly half, or 42%, of the entire Native American or Alaska Native population. That is a large, large swath of the population group. And so, as you can see, it greatly affects that demographic. And when you combine these factors, they really indicate a very real need to take immediate action in a number of areas, including the removal of harmful images, as well as education for the general public to help diffuse additional harmful activities and imagery against Native peoples. Your school board and your community has the opportunity this evening to consider perhaps different perspectives. And next tonight, you will hear from NCAI's first vice president and the chairperson of the Sault Ste. Marie Tribe of Chippewa Indians, Dr. Payman, to give his perspective as the leader of his tribal nation. And later, as you've heard, you'll hear a little bit from my colleague, Dr. Ian Record, for more insight into the movement away from Native mascots and a little bit of the work that NCAI, our allies, and others are doing today on this front. So with that, I thank you for the opportunity to speak with you this evening. I hope that you really listen with open hearts and open minds to Chairperson Payman up next. And we're happy to sit with you and continue the conversation a little later on in this evening. So with that, thank you very much.
Absolutely. Ani buju biwak chigandition kans matwa magizi indorum bauting and donjaba nishnabe ojibwe odawa otawatami and dao. So my name is Payman. I'm the chairperson of my tribe. I'm a high school dropout and I have several advanced degrees in education. So I've made it my business to do the research on the academic side to match my activism. I've been involved in this fight since the 1980s when I was an undergrad, and so I also want to echo, I'm very honored to be on a panel with Suzanne Harjo because I cited her over the years and the work that she's done, and it's motivated me. So I'm very grateful to be part of this panel. So I speak at school boards, I speak to media, wherever anybody wants me to talk about this issue, I'm more than happy to try to educate other people about this issue. One very simple question for people to ask for school leaders is if they're unsure that the use of these mascots is racist, is to ask, why are we the only race that is subjected to the use of these mascots? Another simple test is to substitute any other race for the name of a team. You would not allow it for any other race, but somehow we're subjected to it. And so why are we the only race that's befitting of this honor? Spoiler alert, it is not an honor to be subjected to this experience. So as an educational leader, I'd like to begin by addressing fellow school leaders on the subject of culturally appropriate climate. School leaders used to follow the Interstate Leadership Licensure Consortium and to provide for a culturally appropriate environment for all students to learn. So now, since 2015, we follow the National Policy Board for Education Administration and outlines professional standards for educational leaders. And I want to go through these because it'll demonstrate to you the inconsistency with our charge as professionals and what's happening right under our noses. So under Standard 1, the national policy describes that effective educational leaders, A, develop an educational mission for the school to promote the academic success and well-being of each student. B, promote a vision for the school on the successful learning and development of each child and on instructional and organizational practices that promote such successes. And C, advocate and cultivate core values that define the school's culture, including child-centered education, equity, inclusiveness, social justice, openness, caring, and trust. Then under Standard 2, ethics and professional norms, it calls for placing children at the center of education and accept responsibility for each student's academic success and well-being. That's sub C. D is safeguard and promote the values of equity, social justice, and diversity. And E, lead with an understanding of all students' backgrounds and cultures. Then under Standard C, equity and cultural responsiveness, it identifies that effective educational leaders, A, ensure that each student is treated fairly, respectfully, and with an understanding of each student's culture and context. And then B, recognize, respect, and employ each student's strengths, diversity, and culture as aspects of teaching and learning. E, confront and alter institutional biases of student marginalization and low expectations associated with race, class, culture, and language. And F, promote the preparation of students to live productively and contribute to the diverse cultural context. So an important question to ask is, how do we know that the use of mascots for American Indian race and only our race is inconsistent with our professional ethical standards educational leaders and school leaders are bound by? In 2005, American Psychological Association called for the immediate retirement of all American Indian mascots, symbols, images, and personalities by schools, colleges, universities, athletic teams, and organizations. This position is based on a growing body of social science literature that shows that the harmful effects of racial stereotyping and inaccurate racial portrayals includes the particularly harmful effects of American Indian sports mascots on the social identity and development and self-esteem of Native young people. Continued use of these mascots, symbols, images, and personalities has a negative effect on not only American Indian students, but on all students by undermining the educational experiences of members of all communities, especially those who've had little or no contact with Indigenous people. Further use of these mascots establishes an unwelcome and oftentimes hostile learning environment for Native students that affirms negative images and stereotypes that are promoted in mainstream society. According to Stephanie Freiberg, University of Arizona, American Indian mascots are harmful, not only because they're often negative, but because they remind American Indians of the limited ways in which others see them. This in turn restricts the number of ways American Indians can see themselves. Further, American Indian mascots undermine the ability of American Indian nations to portray accurate and respectful images of our culture, spirituality, and traditions, present stereotypical images of American Indians. Such mascots are a contemporary example of a prejudice of the dominant culture against racial and ethnic minority groups, and is a form of discrimination against American Indian nations. According to the former APA president, Dr. Ronald Lamont, the use of American Indian mascots as symbols in schools and university athletic programs is particularly troubling because schools are places of learning. These mascots are teaching stereotypical, misleading, and too often insulting images of American Indians. These negative lessons are not just affecting American Indian students, they send the wrong message to all students. And so when you ask yourself, if you use such mascots based on American Indian race, the use of it was not derogatory, why are American Indians the only race to be subjected to this practice? And so here's a picture of our young people at NCI a couple years ago, and we ask that you rethink, replace, and rename these mascots, and then also a thank you on behalf of our future generations. On your question, Dr. Ian, I have attended school board meetings, and I have to tell you, I'm a very strong, resilient person, but I have experienced the racism that the families experience. In particular, at one school, I sat next to a parent, and they had a freshman in high school, their child who's Native, and I had to watch the argument being made to people who I would expect would be more learned and knowledgeable about this experience. And just watch, I could feel the heaviness on that young person. And then watch one by one people get up and say, well, we're honoring you. What's wrong with you? We're honoring you. And then watch fake Indian people get up and be given the floor to testify on behalf of why this is acceptable for American Indians. The whole experience is just so blatantly racist and derogatory. And it's unfortunate that people who don't experience this understand how culturally insensitive they are when they allow this. But it is our job to try to educate other people, and I'm committed to doing that. At the school in Cincinnati, I drove down 8 hours to get there, and then I testified, then I drove 8 hours back. And I can tell you, I had to pray, I had to smudge, I had to ask my ancestors for some healing because of the historical and intergenerational trauma that it provoked in me. But imagine a young person having to put up with that every day. And so with that, we can build the resiliency and recommit our efforts and help to eradicate this racist practice. My hope is in the future, I'll look back and say that I made a contribution, and that I can't believe how uncivilized and savage people were that we even allowed this to happen that long. Keep it rich.
Thank you to Janna and to Dr. Payman. It's I think a testament to his commitment, the fact that he drove 16 hours round trip to speak for 3 minutes at a school board meeting a couple states away. So, he's spent a good part of his life, not just experiencing it, but studying it and really understanding the state of the knowledge on this and what the evidence shows. I wanted to thank Janna again for her wonderful presentation and really framing it. I did want to stress one point about just who NCAI is, to give you a sense of on whose behalf we speak. So I believe, as she mentioned, we've been around for quite a while. We were established back in 1944. We are essentially the oldest, largest, and most representative national organization representing tribal governments and their citizens. And so she mentioned the resolutions, the many resolutions that we have speaking to this issue, speaking to Indian country's opposition to the continued use of these names, these mascots, this imagery, et cetera. And a couple important points to stress with that is that our organization is a Congress, as its name indicates. We are a Congress of tribal nations. Hundreds of tribal nations from across the country get together twice a year, and they send delegates. Their tribal governments each send a delegate to the Congress, and those delegates speak for and vote on behalf of those nations. And they pass resolutions not by majority rule, but by consensus. And so you basically have in these resolutions codified the unified voice of a large swath of Indian country. And so I mention that because, you know, we've been on record on this issue for more than 50 years. And our position has been consistent. And I've, in the many engagements that I've done with school boards such as yourself, I've been asked, you know, why is Indian country suddenly offended by this? They're not suddenly offended by this. They've always been offended by this. It's just now that mainstream society is finally paying attention. And we at NCI and tribal leaders are finally getting platforms like this. I can tell you if we, it would be a very rare occurrence 5 years ago to be able to get this kind of audience with a group of folks such as yourself. And I think it's a reflection of the fact that our country's moving in a much different way than we were years ago. And again, I think as Janna stressed, it's really about education, and we're here to educate you guys. We don't pretend that this is something you're going to have all figured out tonight. We're here to be a resource for you moving forward. We understand that this is often a very long and deliberate learning process and sort of process of working things out and trying to figure out a new path forward. And we're just wanted to stress that we're here as a resource for you as you consider the decision. If you make the decision, as you go through the transition, we've worked with hundreds of schools across the country, and we've learned a lot about what schools are doing and how they're doing it and what's working and what's not. And so with that, I wanted to pull up my presentation here. And if you'll give me 1 second, I'm not used to presenting on this. Hopefully you can see this here. Are you guys able to see this?
Yes.
All right. So, I already covered this. We've been on record on this issue for the last 53 years. There's been a lot of movement in this area ongoing over the last 50 years. Obviously, as you guys well know, and probably the reason you're having the discussion, there's been a frenzy of activity over the past year or so, particularly since the murder of George Floyd. But if you just look at some of the highlights, some of the big wins, if you will, in this space over the past 50 years, people forget, for example, back in 1972, Stanford University, before that time, was the Indians. And this is an example of their mascot. St. John's University used to be the Red Men. There's their mascot. And on and on. And, at the professional level, we've obviously had some major developments. Janna mentioned the Washington football team. That was a fight we've been waging on multiple fronts for decades, educating corporate America, educating the local political leaders, educating the league, the team, et cetera. And then the Cleveland baseball team. And I should note that we continue to work very closely directly with the Cleveland baseball team. We were front and center in their educational process as they worked internally to figure out, should we retire our mascot? If so, how do we do it? What do we need to learn in order to then teach our fan base about the change, that sort of thing? And we're continuing to work with them in that process. One of the things we did, and it just happened to coincide with launch around the same time as George Floyd's murder, is we unveiled our school mascot tracking database. And this tracks all public K-12 schools across the country. And it enables us to learn in real time what's going on at the individual school level. It also enables us, when we receive a request from someone in a local community that has a school with a Indian themed name, mascot, imagery, fan rituals, you name it, they'll ask us for assistance. And because of this database, we're able to figure out who is it we need to engage with at the school leadership level. And we've had, because of this, we've been able to engage, like I said, in a second, but you see that despite in this slide, you see that despite the incredible progress we've made, this is the extent of what we're dealing with still. You have still close to 2,000 schools, public schools across the country, representing just over 1,000 school districts with some form of what we call a native theme mascot. And think about how many students those schools teach. Another nugget I would like to throw out is that while I believe it's the case that your student body has few, if any, Native students, 93% of Native students across the country are educated in public schools. And so, a lot of them go to, border town public schools or even public schools on the tribal reservations. And a lot of them go to schools that have these mascots, that have this imagery. And so as Dr. Payman referenced, they're seeing this, they're being besieged by these sorts of symbols and imagery and honestly behavior born of those things every single day in terms of how they're treated by other students. And so this is just a quick synopsis of the numbers, some of the key numbers. As of earlier this week, we had engaged a total of 195 individual school districts in the last 10 months or so. Of those, 46 have proceeded to retire their native theme mascots so far. A lot of them are still what we would call in process. They're still going through the listening, learning and education engagement process with tribal nations leaders, et cetera. And we've also tracked 28 other schools that have similarly retired their mascot, schools that had undertaken their own learning processes and had arrived at their decisions independent of our engagement. In 2020 alone, there were 68 schools that changed their mascots, and so far in this year, we've tracked 6 that have made the change. And that doesn't mean they're actually changing their mascot overnight. It just means they've made a formal binding decision to retire their mascot altogether, to remove offensive imagery, whatever it is that we deem to have them included in our count. And then we know of currently at least 7 schools that have mascot votes pending, meaning that they've got something on the books for an upcoming vote. These are just a couple quotes I wanted to share with you just briefly. And there's a lot more slides, but I'm not going to go through most of them. But these quotes, I think, are emblematic of the issue, emblematic of where we feel the movement is right now, and just some things that we think you ought to just kind of keep in your head. So the first quote is from Julia Dye. She's a member of the Pokagon Band Potawatomi tribe. She said, "I've heard, quote, it's our tradition, unquote, but then segregation was a tradition as well. Our identity is not yours to own. Just because it's nostalgic doesn't mean it's yours. We also get that argument that we're erasing history if we remove these mascots. No, we're fact-checking history." And here's another testimonial from Elizabeth Solomon, who's a member of the Massachusetts tribe at Ponkapog. She says, "Rather than talking about the potential value of a native mascot, come and get to know us, learn our history, think about what we actually do provide to this community. That would be truly honoring us." And then a school board trustee in Idaho said, "Enough is enough. It's time to make the change." And in these following slides, and I'll just kind of roll through them quickly, I just wanted to include for the board's edification, and this is just a sampling of school changes of those schools that have Indians, the word Indians mascots. So obviously wouldn't directly apply here, but most of the testimonials you see here are directly relevant to what we're addressing here this evening. And so I'll flip through these. And I'll continue on. You see kind of in the visuals in the top right, the kinds of imagery that these schools proliferate across their campuses on their school uniforms, things like that. And then I'll leave you, as we open up for questions and answers, if we have time for that, just with a final slide that to us is kind of indicative of some of the experiences that Janna referenced, that Dr. Payman referenced. And these are actually schools that we're still either engaging with or trying to engage with to get them to understand the Native perspective on this, and the fact that what one side feels is honoring, the other side is saying certainly isn't. So with that, I will wrap up my portion of the presentation and open it, I guess, back up to Mary.
Thank you so much, Ian and Janna. That was really enlightening and educational, and we so appreciate your willingness to come talk to us and work with us as we look at these things. With that, I guess I'll turn it back over to President Schefter.
Thank you, Dr. Danskowski, and thank you very much for the presentation. It was wonderful. We really appreciate Dr. Eckert and Ms. Allen taking the time to be with us this evening. Now we have the opportunity as school board members. They've been gracious enough to stay along with us and answer any questions we may have. So I will open the floor to any board member who has questions. Well, I'll hop in. I have one that comes to mind. The question I've heard from citizens is really to try to differentiate some of the imagery we've seen from what we have. For example, with the Cleveland Indians, it's a very generic Indian with the stereotypical racial imagery. And I've had people say, you know, what we have with the Susquehannock Warriors and the logo that we're talking about is specific to a tribe, specific to what was an attempt, whether it's historically correct or not, I have no idea, but it was supposed to replicate the Susquehannock tribe warrior. And so there's a differentiation between a Cleveland Indian imagery and something very specific to honor a tribe that's no longer around. And this is the best and perhaps the only way for our community to recognize that specific tribe. So that's what we hear as board members a lot. So I was wondering if one of you could address that.
Sure, I can jump in. Janna can add on if she wishes. You know, I won't disagree that the Cleveland, I assume you're referring to the Chief Wahoo mascot, which we actually worked directly with the league and the team to get that phased out, as they referred to it back in 2018, and then ultimately they decided to do away with the Indians' name and mascot altogether. But you know, I can just tell you, having been a student of this issue for a long time, and having, and I think Dr. Payman referenced it. You know, I look at your current logo as it appears online, and to me, it perpetuates a sort of a stereotypical image of a Native person as warlike, and kind of conforming to those very antiquated stereotypes that you saw in the John Wayne Westerns of the 1950s. You know, Native people is kind of this monolithic warlike creature. It's certainly not in any way aligned with contemporary Native peoples and the diversity they have, how they see themselves, and that sort of thing. And, you know, we have run into in a few other instances with other schools where they view their embrace of their current mascot as somehow honoring a tribe that's no longer around. And I we've tried to work with them on that. For example, often there are descendants of that particular tribe that have, that eventually were subsumed into other tribes. And so we've actually connected those schools with those other tribes. And then those tribes have spoken directly to those schools about how they feel about these mascots. And I don't know about the particulars of the feasibility of that here. But I think just generally speaking, the logo that we see with your school is sort of indicative of what so many Native people find problematic about, sort of pigeonholing Native people as kind of warlike, stuck in the past, conforming to these antiquated stereotypes that a lot of folks have long had about Native people. And so, Janna?
Yeah, to piggyback off of that, I would agree. That's one of the things that I've kind of noticed both in our work with NCAI, but also being from Oklahoma personally, there are many tribal nations represented there, and we've had many different mascot and imagery issues in the state as well. And that is something that I know a lot of folks, at least back home in my community, do battle against, because, just outside of just the school system itself, it really does kind of have an overarching effect on Native citizens across the country as well. So when these images and logos and names in some other cases are still perpetuated, it really does kind of make a blanket kind of term for other tribal nations elsewhere as well. It's not necessarily intended to, represent all 574, let's say, federally recognized tribal nations, of course, and we know that. But then at the same time, the general public who aren't as well informed can kind of misconstrue that, and it does still have repercussions for, again, Native youth in particular, but Native peoples across the country from different tribal nations as well. So I would just encourage folks to kind of, again, I'm really big about just considering alternatives and different perspectives and seeing things from different angles, just to get a really strong look at it from every perspective possible. But I think that's one of the things to definitely keep in mind.
Thank you. I appreciate that. One follow-up question, then Bruce, I'll get to you. Well, I noticed during the doctor's slideshow presentation, a logo, and then I just pulled up the website. Your logo for NCAI appears to be an Indian in a headdress. Can you distinguish, how's that compared to ours? Would that be okay if we had that one, that logo?
So we've gotten that question a couple of times. I think it comes down to ownership in many respects. This is a national organization of tribal nations representing themselves and claiming their own identity, as opposed to, a school that is claiming another's identity. I think is probably a simple way to think about it. And we have spent 77 years educating the general public about the incredible diversity that is Native America. And I think when particularly in a school environment, and I can't tell you how many times I've gotten this retort from a school board member, when we propose that they retire their mascot, a school board member will say to us, well, then what will our students learn about Native people? That's kind of a frightening thought, right? That often the only thing that in many school environments where there's a school mascot like this, the only thing that they're consuming, if you will, about Native people is a mascot that either distorts, diminishes, renders into some kind of monolithic entity, a group of people, and then sticks them in the far distant past. And so, and I don't know if we have time to get into it tonight, but the other point I wanted to raise is that among the Warriors schools in particular, we've seen a couple of things happening. One is we've seen clean breaks. So in other words, schools deciding to retire the name and mascot and changing completely. And then we've seen, you know, I guess for lack of a better term, a compromise measure where they retain the name, but they do away with the imagery. They essentially inoculate the school against this sort of criticism by saying, we're just going to come up with a new image, a new symbol, a new logo, whatever you want to call it, and basically de-Indianize it, if you will. I mean, that's probably not the best term, but I think you guys get what I'm saying. You know, if you look at the Golden State Warriors, great example of this, Golden State Warriors, right? If you look at back what their mascot was prior to 1971, it would turn your stomach. Okay, they went that route, and now no one knows that they were once, you know, had one of the most offensive kind of Chief Wahoo-like caricature mascots around. You know, just to kind of give you a sense of a historical perspective.
I appreciate that answer. Thank you very much. Mr. Baumann.
Thank you, President Schefter. Could you help me out to try to understand the difference between our warrior head imagery and other imagery, especially in sports? And the one that two actually come to my mind. One is the Notre Dame leprechaun, and the other is the Minuteman that the Boston Patriots use. Now, they both perpetuate stereotypes of different groups of people. Is there a line? Is there a difference that I'm missing somewhere?
Well, yeah, there is. I would say that the fundamental difference is that Native people are still here, and they're explaining to you how they find these things, these sorts of imagery to be problematic. You know, I think if you know, the Minutemen are not still here, if they had a problem with it, I think you should listen to them. And leprechauns aren't real, so I mean, I guess that would be.
But what about Irish people?
Well, so that, you know, so Notre Dame Fighting Irish. If they came to you en masse and said, if you had such a logo, and said we find this offensive, then I think you should listen to them. You know, we don't speak for them, just like we don't want other folks speaking for Native people. And I think that's fundamentally what we're talking about. Is we have, you know, as an organization, spent close to 80 years trying to get mainstream society to understand that Native people are perfectly capable of speaking for themselves and don't need to have their identities, you know, basically depicted for them by others, if that makes sense. And Janna, I definitely would like you to chime in here.
Yeah, definitely. So that is one of the key things that I know not just NCAI, but countless other national Native organizations have really raised the game. One of the particular organizations I would alert you to is Illuminative. They've done a lot of work in this mascot space as well. And that's really the key issue here, is that Native voices haven't necessarily had the kind of platform that we've been allowed in the last couple of years. And that's not to say that there haven't been voices, they just haven't had the loudest megaphone to be able to voice their opinion and have it be taken in and considered and being part of the national dialogue in various issue areas. And so today it's a different day. We have a lot of folks across Indian country who have spoke out about this particular issue. We just happen to represent quite a few of them within CAI, but I would still encourage you, beyond just taking our word for it, do the research, look out for other Native voices that are speaking in this space. And, you know, the evidence is there, and they really do. People speak for themselves, and they'll be able to tell you how they feel about the situation.
Yeah, thank you, Janna. And I had one piggyback point on that. You know, we always tell folks in this setting to do the research, but we're also happy to share with you the research that we've already collected. And we, you know, like we said at the beginning, we don't we don't expect this to be our final conversation with you. I imagine you'll leave tonight with more questions than you had coming in. And so just know we're there as a resource. Dr. Payman mentioned in his presentation, Dr. Stephanie Freiberg, she's the leading social science researcher on this subject. And one thing he touched on that I wanted to flag, and we can send you more information about it, is she's done systematic research that shows that not only are these kinds of mascots and imagery detrimental to Native students, they actually are incredibly detrimental to non-Native students as well. And cultural competency, yeah, but she kind of drills down to the next level and talks about how it can actually lead to some negative outcomes for non-Native students as well. So we'd be happy to connect you with that research subsequent to this meeting.
Thank you, Dr. Record. Ms. Kalina.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for the wonderful presentation this evening. This has been wonderful for all of us, and we appreciate your time so much. I'd like to give a shout out to Mary and our diversity committee for actually doing what you're saying, doing the research and having this kind of discussion. And we've been actually looking at this for the past 6 months now, and I can say it's been illuminating and wonderful and rewarding, and I wish everybody in our school district could know all the nuances of it, and they're probably not going to know that. But one thing I wanted to ask was, when you were talking about some of the schools where their names were warrior, we had heard that it's not necessarily a problem if the school was named for a tribe or the warrior name, that isn't necessarily at issue. So in the cases where these schools had kind of maybe did a hybrid where they kept kept the name and evolved the mascot. I mean, I think mascots evolve, generally speaking, anyway, for any organization throughout history. They always evolve. We grow as people, so it's not unlikely. But like for me, a lot of what I learned too is the wonderfulness about the warrior spirit, about being leaders for everyone, about taking care of the least among us, about taking care of the planet and the land and all of those things too that we learn from Native Americans. Is that okay to explore?
I mean, it's on the one level, I think it's a little hard to ponder and respond to a hypothetical. I will say that, like I mentioned earlier, we are an organization that's a Congress. We're governed by resolution, and so we as staff, we as advocates, we get our marching orders from those resolutions. So we base our work, we base our responses to questions like this based upon what our resolutions tell us, and so I can tell you in some instances among those other schools that have done that kind of hybrid thing you referred to is, well, maybe not hybrid, but back to how I define the compromise measure, where they retain the warrior's name, but they basically de-Indianize the imagery. Once they kind of complete that process and they come up with their new logo, imagery, et cetera. So often they're actually vetting it through us, and typically what they're doing is they're going with something that's like a clean break. When you look at it visually, it's a clean break, and I think that's probably the smartest path, if that is what the path you decide to take. I can tell you that there will be Indian country advocates that will probably will not be happy with any kind of compromise measure. But I think most folks will treat as genuine a school that does that kind of thing and really makes a concerted effort to understand what of the preceding imagery was offensive and really making a clean break from it. But I want to stress something. It's not just the imagery. I don't know off the top of my head how long you guys have had that particular image and logo and all that. But you've got a whole culture, school culture, that's been built up around that. And just to think long and hard about what has become part and parcel with that you're going to also have to think about if you do decide to make a change, that's got to change as well. So, like, what do your football games look like? Are they doing any kind of team rituals or fan rituals that, are also troubling, and they flow from that imagery? I don't know. I have never gone to one of your football games, your basketball games, so I don't know. But and the other point too is we understand that there is a cost to this kind of decision, and that's not to say that it's an excuse for inaction. But we understand that for schools, particularly in time of COVID and all the virtual learning stuff you guys have had to do and the cost associated with that this is not going to be a flip the switch for most schools to make these kinds of transitions. And honestly, it's actually in some respects it's actually a positive, because if the transition takes a while, it's an opportunity to continue to educate. And we've actually seen some really amazing scenarios unfold where the students really get into creating something new and that they have ownership in. So we've seen student art competitions to design the new logo, and and then the students vote on it, and the top 3 designs move up to the next level, and then and then they get involved in it. We've seen community crowdfunding campaigns to help defray the cost for the schools. We've seen volunteerism where school boards are able to solicit volunteers to come in and help repaint gym walls and paint the new logo on and all that kind of stuff. So schools are getting really creative, and there's no magic bullet formula for how you do this. It's just making sure that you keep moving forward, you keep learning, and we'll do our part to help you learn from other schools as you guys move through this process.
Thank you. Mr. Doris, you had your hand up earlier. Do you still have a question, John?
No, thanks. It was answered in Mr. Record's last comments. Thank you.
Thank you. Judy, Ms. Fisher. I see your hand up.
Thank you, Bob. Yeah, thank you, Bobby. Dr. Record, Ms. Allen, and Dr. Payman, thank you so much for being here tonight. I wish that there were parents showing up on my screen, community members. I see all school people. I certainly hope that I know they've been notified of this meeting, and I certainly hope they will go online and watch this proceedings. And Dr. Record, you had mentioned Dr. Freiberg's analysis of the self-esteem of Native children when they're young. And just to let you know that in the report our diversity committee did on page 7, they do mention that report. And in fact, the last school meeting, when we talked about this, the thing that stuck out to me the most was the lower self-esteem and the lower community worth of the children. And as far as I'm concerned, there is no cost that can prevent anyone from helping to take away something that that lends itself to the lower esteem of any child of any persuasion. So that was like something that Judy had to say. And Debbie did talk about the use of the word warriors. This was a question of mine. So also, as far as the image goes, would something like, if they changed it, would something like an Indian head or a dream catcher, would that also be something that that would be objectionable? Just throwing it out there.
Janna, did you want to lead on that, or I can take it if you want?
I think, well, sure, you can jump in too. I was just going to say, I know a lot of times we do get questions like that along those lines, but particularly it hasn't necessarily been a dream catcher, but I know we've had other schools reach out and ask about totem poles, for example. And those are things that we typically refer schools and other interested parties to reach out to the tribal nations directly, because some of those things may have particular religious, spiritual, cultural meaning behind them. And so, we always, of course, recommend consultation with tribal nations. I know that's not necessarily the case here, but I think just going back to what Ian said earlier, a lot of times, just to kind of make that clear distinction, if you are going to take action, that's one of the things to consider, that still kind of links to this idea of just sort of popularized and potentially stereotyped imagery that is kind of at the core of this conversation as well. So I would just encourage to kind of think along those lines as well. But Ian?
No, I think you said it well. I mean, I think there would be a lot of folks across the country that would view that as just another form of cultural appropriation, particularly the dream catchers. A lot of the work that we do is with educating corporate America about the choices that they make. And so, one of the things we've been doing is working with like large retailers to try to get them to dial back on those sorts of things that, again, sort of reduce Native people to a simple caricature, dream catcher, tomahawk, the kind of symbols that, if you did a Rorschach test with the average American and you would say tribe or American Indian, that would be the first word out of their mouth, right? So yeah, hopefully.
I'm sorry. No, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, I said hopefully that's helpful. One other. It's not so much the case. My sense is not so much the case here, but I've always been struck by a quote from the school board president, actually, in Anderson High School, which Chairman Payman referenced. That was the one he drove 16 hours round trip to. That they had the R word mascot, and this was a bitter, divisive fight. It went on for years. I personally had friends in that area who were trying to get the mascot retired, who had to transfer their children out of the school for fear of physical violence. I mean, that's how bad it was. And the school board president, right before they took a vote, finally to retire it, he said, I'm an alumni of this school. He said, we've been dealing with this issue for 2 decades. And he said, every time it came up, either as a community member or as a school board member, I've been looking for a way to kick the can down the road and not have to deal with it. And he said, but he said, ultimately, I realized that mascots are meant to unite and not to divide. And he goes, it doesn't really matter what I personally think about the appropriateness of this mascot. It's dividing our community, and mascots are supposed to unite, and we need to find a mascot that can unite us. And that's the last words he said before they took a vote. And I lay that out there because I think it gets to the crux of the issue, which is that there's no easy path here. There's no magic bullet. There's just kind of continuing to listen, continuing to learn, and we encourage you to learn from other Native voices beyond the two of us, beyond NCAI. We can connect you with the other leading researchers and tribal leaders on this issue. We can. There is an organization called the Coalition of Natives and Allies that is based in Pennsylvania, New Jersey. I believe we mentioned them to Mary and Jim leading up to this meeting. These are Native folks that live in Pennsylvania, New Jersey, New York areas. They've gotten together to form this organization because they have Native students that either go to schools with these kinds of mascots or go to schools that play sports against these kind of mascots, and their children are dealing with these issues on a daily basis, and they've formed an organization to make sure their voices are heard. And so we'd be happy to connect you with other voices on this.
Well, thank you for answering my question. And again, thank you for being here. You're preaching to the choir as far as I'm concerned. And also, as far as the word warrior, when this whole thing came up, there was a massive a rumor around town that we were changing everything, the name and the logo and the warrior, and a lot of people signed on to that, and hopefully that's been straightened out. And when I looked the word warrior up in the dictionary, Actually, one of the definitions in there, he gave a sentence, and the sentence was, "She went through cancer treatment like a warrior." So there's many ways of protecting, what's the word, of depicting a warrior. And I don't think it has to have to do anything with any type of Native American imagery whatsoever. So,
Well,
thank you again.
and I would just say, you know, what a wonderful opportunity for your school community to create a new definition. Right?
Absolutely, absolutely right. Thank you.
Exemplified in that logo.
Jim, I thought you had your hand up and I don't see it now. Do you still have a question or was it addressed?
No, it was addressed.
Okay, Mr. Bauman.
Thank you, Mr. President. Just one final comment to Judy's comment about retaining the word warrior. And, you know, the scuttlebutt around the community was we were going to get rid of warrior. We were going to get rid of the high school name Susquehannock. And we talked about, well, really it's only the Indian or the Native American head imagery that we need to get rid of. But, you know, think about it. You got the name Susquehannock, you got the name warrior. If you're a thoughtful person and make the connection between those two, what image does that take you to? And I haven't come up with an answer that says it takes you to anything but a Native American warrior's head. And that's not really a question. I apologize. It's a comment.
Bobby, could I make a comment?
Sure, absolutely.
Mr. Record mentioned he didn't know how our present logo was established, and someone gave me a printed paper that had the story. The logo that we have today is not the original logo that the school used. It was a profile of an Indian head in a full feathered headdress, which I've seen you had several other schools had used that. And there are Native Americans that live in York County. I'm not aware of any that live in our school district, but there are several Native Americans that are associated with the Indian Steps Museum. Indian Steps is an area over next to the Susquehanna River, and it's a museum that has a lot of local Indian artifacts from the area. So the school in the late 60s, early 70s, as I was told, was approached by one of these Native Americans that our logo is not really representative of a warrior, but more of a chief. And to be more in line with our warrior nomenclature, we should look at something more that represents a logo. And it was suggested, I guess, what basically is our logo today. And that actually came off of a document that was made and is in the State Museum that has a depiction almost exactly like our present day logo. And I saw there are other people that have almost the same logo. So that's how we got what we have today. And my understanding is it was actually provided to the school by a Native American person.
Thanks, Jim. I don't know if that evokes any response from Ms. Allen or Dr. Record. Okay.
No, it's just a comment.
Right, sure. Thank you, Mr. Holly. Ms. Jarvis, see your hand up.
Yeah, thank you, President Schefter, and thank you so much for all the wonderful information that you have given us tonight. My question is, I guess it's more of like a personal question of what you both think as far as the shift of schools removing mascots, like you said, it's been so much more within the past, I don't know, half dozen years. What would you contribute that shift to? And then also, do you know of any schools that you've been dealing with that have sent surveys out to, say, like the students and the alumni? And if you might happen to know, if you do know of schools that have sent surveys, if you find that students are in favor more than, say, the alumni.
So on the surveys question, the answer is yes. I know a lot of schools have sent out surveys. I don't recall offhand what the particular results are. I can tell you just anecdotally that typically the students tend to be more in favor of change than the alumni, and I think that's probably a generational thing. You know, I've lost count of how many times we've started engagement with a school because a student has reached out to us, or a recent alumni, not a graduated 34 years ago. I'm talking like somebody that got out a year or two ago of high school and maybe he's in college now. That's often how these change movements at the local level are being initiated. Is you have a student or typically a group of students that have banded together and are, I think, more aware of what's going on socially around them, not just in their local community, but nationally. And obviously, flashpoints like, George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and some of the other things that have happened over the last year, I think, combined with the pandemic where people are stuck at home and have more time to ponder these kinds of issues. It's been something to behold. And, one other thing I should mention is that, one of the major reasons why the Washington football team made their change, why Cleveland has made its change, is not just because of an outcry from the Native community. It's been an outcry from society at large and leading organizations representing and serving other communities of color. Our effort to get Washington to change their name was in no small part due to the fact that our national partners like the NAACP, the National Urban League, Unidos US, which is the largest national organization representing Latinos, Asian Pacific Islander American Health Forum, joined forces with us because they have been subjected to these kinds of things in the past. And, so they've been where Native people still are. And, it sort of begs the question, they're as incredulous as Dr. Payman was about why is it that Native people are still the only ones subjected to these kinds of things in popular culture, whether in a sports team or in the movies or what have you. So something to think about, and as far as, I think the surveys have been helpful. I think they help to build ownership. Obviously, a lot depends on how they're designed and what kind of questions they're asking. But anytime you ask for people's opinion in a constructive way, I think you're gonna gain ownership and foster a deeper dialogue that can only lead to better things down the road.
Thank you, Dr. Record. And all right, Ms. Fisher, I see you have your hand up. Go ahead.
Yeah, just quickly, I had forgot to mention before that in one of your slides entitled "The 5 Decades of Progress," I had noticed that this is such a passionate issue. Now, I know that we're not using the the R word. We're not talking about that. We're talking about a depiction. But when you feel so strongly for 40 years that when you type the R word, you use the asterisk so you don't type it up. Much like, well, I don't want to say that, much like a lot of people use other words, it's R asterisk, D, DSK asterisk, asterisk. So my point is, when you're that strongly, when the feeling of 574 recognized national tribes and dozens of state tribes, as Ms. Allen said, when you're that passionate over something, that really must lead people to understand that it's how you feel and it's how the nations feel. So I just wanted to bring that up. I had noticed that on that slide that you don't write the word out. And I think that's great and proper. So that's all I have to say. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. I want to make a comment along the lines of what Jim did, not necessarily looking for an answer, but I want Dr. Record and Ms. Allen to know this in case you haven't been informed of this throughout. But when you talk about how the issue was raised, I'll never forget it. We got a letter from a student, and it wasn't a Native American student, it was an African American student. And part of the letter said words to the effect of, well, if this is how they portray Native Americans, what do they think of me? And, that really hit home. That's like directly to the point as to, it doesn't matter if we have 0 Native American students. There are Native American students and adults out there who are going to see what we have. And we definitely have a beautiful population of minority students. And if it has that effect on them, then we really need to consider what we have. So I wanted to share that in case it hadn't been shared. And I want to make a comment as far as, I think Judy alluded to it. We have 34 people here. Petitions went out and thousands of people signed it. They didn't know what they were signing. I don't know who signed it, but then they come back and say, you got to change this, or you don't have to change it because we have these petitions. And I'm sorry, but if you don't take the time to attend this, to read the report that our committee came up with, your opinion is going to not carry much persuasion with this board member. So I know people are busy, everybody has things to do, but that's discouraging on both sides. Some people will refuse to change their opinion either way. I guarantee you, when we have our regular meeting next month, there'll be a lot of public comment. There'll be a lot of your cancer or culture cancel, and there'll be a lot on both sides. And I think, our public should be in attendance and they should be well informed. And I question whether we're going to have that. We have 2, authoritative representatives here tonight on a national level. And I would think the people who were opposed to changing the logo would want to hear it, would want to question it, would want to challenge it, and they should hear these opinions, but they're not. And I hope this gets out, and I hope people watch it sometime before the meeting, and they can say, I watched it, I heard what they had to say, I disagree with it, and here's why. Then I'll listen. That's all I have to say. Thank you. Oh, I'm sorry. With that, I'm going to open it up. Well, if any other board member has a question, we can handle it, but I want to open it up to public comment. So I'm going to do that.
Yeah,
Is there
President Shefter,
Yeah.
I'm sorry. If I can just share as well too, that when we do after our last educational committee meeting, we did send out all of the links, the report, the committee meeting as well too. When the survey does go out the week of April the 6th to staff, parents, alumni, students in grades 9 through 12, we will also include within that survey, the full report, the educational committee, the link to tonight as well too. So we're going to do everything that we can do to try and push this out for folks to be able to view all of the components, not have to just go to the website to be able to find any of the documentation. So I just wanted to let our public know that as well.
Thank you, Dr. Lamont. Has anyone signed up for public comment?
No, President Shefter.
Is anyone present in the boardroom or online who wants to make public comment?
There is no one present in the boardroom, President Shefter.
Thank you. Next on the agenda is the Secretary's report. I'm not sure, do we have a Secretary's report for a special meeting? No. additional information and announcements. Dr. Lamont, do you have announcements?
No, the only thing I just wanted to share again is a reminder that the survey will be going out that week of April the 6th and the 9th prior to our board meeting on April the 15th. And I too would like to certainly thank our speakers this evening for giving us the opportunity, as they said, to listen and learn. And we greatly appreciate you taking the time to be with us this evening.
Thank
That's
you.
all I have, President Schefter.
Thank you, Dr. Lamont. On behalf of the board, I want to echo that. Dr. Record, Ms. Allen, thank you so very much for your time. It's been enlightening and informative. And when this came to light last year, you know, I went on the website, I printed out Dr. Freiberg's study and read a lot of different case studies for some of the different school cases, and your website is a wealth of information. So again, you know, thank you for all of that hard work. It's greatly appreciated. It's going to be interesting what comes of this issue in our district. Although, you know, I wholeheartedly agree with everything I heard tonight. I don't think there's a real dispute. Where it's really, we have a community that I respect and that I believe, you know, are well-intentioned, and some people are like very smart people I have the utmost respect for, will have a tie to the logo, and it's going to be whatever this school district does, whatever this board does, it's going to be difficult, whether the board takes action or not. We're going to have to deal with this moving forward. And we will, at least the board and the administration will do so, having been very well informed. So thank you again so much, and very much appreciate the offer to follow if we need to reach out again. I know Dr. Dankowski has been in touch, and we will look forward to that in the future, regardless of what our district votes or our board votes or doesn't vote for. The message is clear, and what needs to be done needs to be done. It's just a matter of how we get there. So for the public, we have at our next regularly scheduled board meeting, it's up to the board members whether there is a motion made and what that motion is, and then the board will vote on it if there is a motion made. And you know, that's as simple as it is. And again, just to repeat, the name Susquehannock, the name Warriors, I don't foresee that being on the moved to a vote. And again, there's a lot of misinformation, and continues to be, as to what the board may or may not consider. What we have been asked and informed and told is that the Native American Indian logo with the warrior head is culturally misappropriation, and that is what has been brought to our attention. That's why we've had this extensive study, and that's why we are considering it next meeting. So again, Dr. Lamont indicated all the ways we're trying to push this out to the public, these informative sessions. So please ask the public to review, do your homework, be well informed. And with that, is there any new business from any board member? Okay, then I have to give one more final thank you for Dr. Record and Ms. Allen. Thank you so much for everything you do, and for taking, you know, good hour and a half out of your time on a Thursday night. I know you're busy, so thank you, and we are adjourned.